In the depths of the night had existed enigmas that defied explanation, mysteries that had lingered like ghosts, and voices that had not escaped the abyssal darkness. The stories that might have sounded like fiction blended seamlessly into a truth, giving an alarming call to those who wandered the streets without fear. Whether you were homeless or earning a roof over your head, you would have prayed to avoid getting across the infamous Jack the Stripper and the Kigali Ripper. In the foggy streets of West London, where the wealthy and the poor lived side by side, a menacing shadow emerged in 1964, causing fear to spread throughout the city. Known as Jack the Stripper, this elusive figure was a deathbringer, lurking in the darkness and targeting the unsuspecting with chilling efficiency. The city was left wondering, who was this Night Stalker, and what sinister secrets were hidden behind his gruesome acts? The 60s were a transformative era for Britain, boldly stepping into the modern age with sweeping music, fashion, and film changes. However, this period of cultural revolution was soon overshadowed by a grim turn of events. By 1964, London was thrust into a dark chapter, reminiscent of its uneasy past, thanks to a serial killer on the prowl. This shadowy figure reopened wounds from the previous century that had yet to fully heal, casting a long shadow over the city's bright new era. The murders near Hammersmith Bridge in West London had a disturbing similarity to the infamous Jack the Ripper killings nearly 80 years prior. Like Jack the Ripper, this new killer slipped through the fingers of one of the most comprehensive police manhunts in British history, reviving old feelings of shame and defeat. What set Jack the Stripper apart as even more menacing was his higher victim count, making this series of crimes one of the most significant unsolved murder cases in Britain's history. The 1960s heralded a cultural revolution in Britain, transforming its capital into the swinging London, known for its liberal attitudes toward morality. This era saw the rise of striptease clubs and prostitution, especially in Soho, becoming more prominent. Meanwhile, West London, particularly around Shepherd's Bush, was characterized by its industrial landscape and working-class communities. Factories dotted the riverside areas in Brentford and Chiswick, while large industrial estates sprawled across Ealing and Acton, situated a few miles north of the river. Despite their proximity to the swinging city, these areas lacked prosperity, and life for street workers was harsh, marked by abuse and violence. Many hesitated to seek police assistance, as authorities often prioritized arresting the prostitutes instead of helping them. Since the area itself was underdeveloped and ignored, it served as a perfect cover for the stripper to claim his victims. The first victim was Elizabeth Figg, who was found dead by patrol officers at 5:10 a.m. on June 17, 1959, in Dukes Meadows, Chiswick, on the north bank of the Thames. She was identified as a 21-year-old petite, quiet, and youthful-looking girl from Cheshire, settled in the Chiswick area of London. Occasionally working as a prostitute to supplement her income, Figg was last seen getting into a vehicle driven by a man on June 16, 1959. She was found on scrubland near Dan Mason Drive, west of Barnes Bridge, with her torn dress revealing her breasts and marks of strangulation around her neck. Figg's underwear and shoes were missing, along with her identification, and her mother identified her through a post-mortem photograph. Despite police certainty that the man she was seen with committed the murder, the lack of witness identification led to the case going cold. Figg's murder was considered a fluke, as years went by until a rather similar incident took place once again near Dukes Meadows. A 22-year-old Welsh woman who had moved to London from Essex was found dead on November 8, 1963, at the Barnesborough Council Household Refuse Disposal Site on Townmead Road, Mortlake. The dump was near the Thames towpath, about a mile from Dukes Meadows. Rees was also a petite and youthful girl, living with her sister and resorting to prostitution for extra income. Rees was found naked with only one stocking on her right leg, reaching to the ankle. She had been strangled to death, and once again, no witnesses were found. The two murders were not associated with each other despite the uncanny resemblance in numerous aspects, including the appearance of the women, the murder site, and the way of the murder. Perhaps a coincidence, or so it was thought, until the numerous murders that took place within a year, marking the presence of a madman on the loose. The next victim of the stripper was Hannah Tailford, a 30-year-old prostitute pregnant with her third child, who went missing for 10 days before her naked body was discovered on February 2nd, 1964, near Hammersmith Bridge. On further inspection, it was determined that she had been thrown into the Thames from Duke's Meadow 24 hours prior. Despite head injuries and being found naked except for her stockings, she wasn't initially recognized as a crime victim. Unfortunately, due to prevailing attitudes, the police saw little value in investigating the death of a prostitute and labeled it a suicide instead. This attitude from the police boosted the morale of the killer, who would soon become a threat to their reputation as well. On April 8th, 1964, the naked body of 26-year-old Irene Lockwood from Nottinghamshire was found in the river in Chiswick. Irene was also a petite and slim woman who was pregnant as Hannah and worked in the same areas, off Bayswater Road in West London. Police determined that she was assaulted and strangled before her body was dumped in the river. Her death, along with Tailford's and Reese's, led to the realization of a serial killer's presence. The press sensationalized the story, drawing parallels to the infamous Jack the Ripper, and dubbing the perpetrator Jack the Stripper. The name itself was an alarming call for the police, bringing back the shame and failure they faced a century ago. The police, more serious than before, increased their patrol in the vicinity, hoping to get their hands on the killer this time. Despite the police on his tail, Jack the Stripper claimed 4 additional lives within a year. Helen Barthelemy, Mary Fleming, Margaret McGowan, and Bridget O'Hara, all petite and beautiful young women, were silenced in the darkened alleys of West London. But what made these murders unique were the revelations about the killer, including his macabre modus operandi. All of these women were strangled to death and were found naked without their front teeth. Additionally, specks of paint were found on their bodies, leading to a theory that the killer might have been an industrial worker somewhere close within the vicinity. The clue opened up doors of numerous possibilities, and the department took no time in chasing down every possibility, hoping to catch the serial killer this time. London's Metropolitan Police, led by top detective John Durose, intensified their search for the killer after Bridget O'Hara's murder. Durose, nicknamed 5-Day Johnny, specialized in solving any case within 5 days. He mobilized hundreds of officers to interview industrial workers and patrol roads at night. He theorized the suspect was small, exposed to spray paint, and possibly worked at night with access to a secure lockup. The investigation intensified when O'Hara's body led to a crucial discovery. Her body was burnt and slightly mummified, indicating that her corpse had been stored somewhere before disposal. This led Durose to a nearby lockup with a transformer, potentially used to keep bodies warm, and coincidentally, the paint from a nearby shop matched that found on O'Hara and other victims, revealing the killer's storage space. Durose excitedly called a press conference suggesting that he was close to catching the killer, and bluffed to have narrowed suspects down to 20 men. But the fateful day never arrived, and despite the intensity of the investigation, the killer remained at large until he decided to stop the killings himself. Many people were suspected, from seasoned criminals to even the police officers themselves, but none of the suspects fit the requirement. Hence, the case was shelved quietly, without any further leads, and the victims were never provided with the justice they deserved. The Ripper's identity and motives remained a grisly secret. Was he a madman, a licentious beast, or something else entirely? The murders of Jack the Stripper once again brought out the weaknesses of the law enforcement department. They highlighted the predicament of the poor and the dangers faced by women, even after the Cultural Revolution. The crimes of Jack the Stripper ended up dragging the city back to the times of horror, mystery, and struggle with its darkest fears, when the law enforcement system failed to bring the Ripper to justice, unveiling the fragility and inadequacy of the law enforcing department. Surely the stripper's motive remains unclear even to this day, but one thing is certain: the legend of the stripper still frightens the women of this city to this day. Deep in the center of Africa's Great Rift Valley is Rwanda, a country scarred by the horror of its most appalling event, the genocide. As the nation struggled, a new horror took shape, one that left behind mutilated victims and terrorized the capital, Kigali. But who was this source of terror? How did he become Kigali's worst nightmare? His nickname alone is enough to tell you about the fear he stirred. Jack the Ripper is a name you might know from the alleys of London, but another monster followed in his footsteps, haunting Kigali with unspeakable acts. This man, called Jack the Ripper of Africa, made the streets of Kigali a place of dread. Before we uncover this unsolvable crime, we would like to ask you to show your support by subscribing to our channel and liking this video. Often celebrated as Africa's Singapore for its remarkable growth, Rwanda has faced its fair share of problems, including corruption and crime. Despite boasting a parliament with a majority of women, it was heartbreaking to see that it's the women of Rwanda who have been hit hardest by these issues. Many have found themselves with no choice but to turn to prostitution due to the country's economic struggles. A survey from 2012 highlighted a troubling reality. Even though prostitution is illegal in Rwanda, there were about 13,000 active sex workers, nearly half of whom were living with HIV. Against a backdrop filled with crime and chaos, a dark figure rose from the shadows of Kigali's slums. Driven by deep-seated anger towards sex workers, this person launched a wave of terror, taking the lives of 15 people. He spread fear throughout the community, leaving many scared to even walk the streets, haunted by the thought that they could be next. The nightmare began in July 2012 when the streets of Kigali became the final resting place for 3 sex workers, each strangled to death within a single month. With no apparent motive, and such tragedies all too familiar, the police quickly dismissed any links between the cases, suggesting financial disputes with clients might be to blame. Yet, in a society already indifferent to the basic rights of its citizens, the dire situation of these women sparked little concern. It was the ideal setup for the Ripper to exploit the vulnerabilities of the place and the time. August 2012 saw the Ripper's horrifying return, this time with a vengeance that sent shockwaves through the community. Throughout the month, 12 sex workers were discovered strangled in the very same streets. Some victims bore the marks of mutilation, while many had been horrifically blinded. Perhaps a declaration that those who crossed paths with the Ripper would see no more. This spree of brutality marked a fear among Rwanda's sex workers and left the police with no choice but to acknowledge a predator was indeed at large. The department took countermeasures by conducting patrols in the affected areas and appointed a special investigation team to solve the case. At first, we thought they were isolated acts. One of the first murders appeared to be linked to a financial dispute, said the police spokesman Theo Badege, but we quickly realized it could be something else. Despite Badege recognizing a pattern in the murders, he still didn't have enough evidence to connect them. However, what happened next was a huge blow to the police department, and it unmistakably showed that the Ripper was fearless and not constrained by time or location in selecting his victims. On August 28, 2012, the Ripper struck once again. In an audacious move, he struck in broad daylight on the bustling streets of Kigali, strangling 3 victims. The 2 victims were identified as prostitutes, while the third was identified to be an accidental witness, who caught a glimpse of the killer, thus sealing her fate. The news of these murders was an insinuation to the people that the Ripper could kill anyone, anywhere, at any time. We are terrified over what has been happening. We ask the authorities to help us and find a solution to this problem because sex workers are dying every day, stated a prostitute who went by the name of Grace. On August 29, 2012, tragedy struck again when Clementine Uwin-Babazi was discovered murdered in her home. Her death was also linked to the Ripper. After her body was examined, disturbing rumors started to spread. Witnesses claimed that the Ripper had inscribed a terrifying message on her chest and stomach. "I will stop once I have killed 400 prostitutes." Yet the police refuted claims of any message being left on the body. The relentless series of murders put immense pressure on law enforcement, prompting them to quickly detain suspects. By September, 2 individuals had been arrested. However, when the killings didn't stop, the police were forced to concede that the Ripper was still at large in Kigali. Complicating the investigation was the challenge of distinguishing between the Ripper's victims and those of other unrelated crimes, as murders in Kigali were alarmingly common. The police, however, assumed the Ripper to be a 30-year-old slender man who was spotted near the murder sites, quite often before or after the murders. However, this description was too general and was of no help. The police assumed the Ripper motive for killing the prostitutes was vengeance, out of spite that he might have had STDs from the prostitutes. In November 2012, the police ended up rounding up 8 suspects, out of which one was identified as the Ripper after his confession. However, his name was not revealed. Instead, the police announced that a trial would take place in the upcoming year, and the suspect will be brought to justice. But the fateful day never came, as the police went silent after January 2013, ceasing to reveal any further information related to the case. This move marked the failure of the police to get their hands on the real Ripper, and multiple assumptions were made by the media and the people. Many believed that the Annunciation was just a ruse to cover the sloppy job the police department had been doing in tracking the Ripper. They believed that the police had hoped that the killer would eventually stop himself. Others thought that the police caught him, but released him as their investigation reached a standstill. Whatever the case was, one thing was quite sure, and that was that the Ripper was still free, as the upcoming year resulted in 2 more losses of life. The year 2014 witnessed another loss, as a woman was strangled to death, as her 8-year-old son slept in the same room beside her. This murder, having the same modus operandi, was also attributed to the Ripper. The killing spree decayed exponentially, not because of the Ripper stopping himself, but because of the purportedly diverted attention of the authorities and the media as they left the Ripper on his own, free from further trial. The national media outside Rwanda completely stopped reporting the story after the initial events, and whatever became afterwards was never brought to light. So what was the reason that made this trail a total failure? Let's find out. In many African countries, efforts to tackle serial killers are hampered by poverty, corruption, and instability, making it challenging for local authorities to connect crimes to a single perpetrator. Although serial killers have been active in various African nations, only South Africa boasts specialized police units and profilers dedicated to tracking them down. A notable characteristic of African serial killers is their tendency to remain within the same locality, theoretically simplifying their capture. However, the lack of resources in most African countries complicates these efforts significantly. Furthermore, these cases often go unnoticed by international and Western media, except for incidents in South Africa. We're left with more questions than answers as we wrap up these stories. It's clear that the mystery of these evil figures isn't confined by geography. Instead, they thrive in places where inequality and injustice run rampant. This persistent threat emphasizes that the roots of terror are deeply embedded in the human psyche. The chilling legacies of these Rippers, which loom over Britain and Rwanda, remind us of the darkness within us all.